At my wedding reception, my sister-in-law grabbed the microphone and said, "Before we toast, everyone should know this is the ugliest dress I've ever seen." So I made her wear it. I got married to my husband Brett last year after dating for 5 years. We had this perfect small wedding at my grandmother's lake house with just family and close friends. I wore my mom's wedding dress from 1987 that she'd kept pristine in storage. It had these puffy sleeves and tons of lace, and honestly, it was so vintage it was cool again. My mom cried when she saw me in it. Everyone said I looked exactly like her wedding photos. It was perfect until Brett's sister Holly showed up late to the ceremony. Holly had just gotten engaged herself to this finance guy named Keith, who had money and wouldn't shut up about it. She took one look at me and actually laughed, out loud, during my vows. After the ceremony, while everyone was congratulating us, Holly pulled me aside and said my dress was the worst wedding gown she'd ever seen. She said it looked like I raided a community theater costume closet. She actually asked if I was too broke to buy a real dress, or if I was trying to be ironic. My new mother-in-law heard her and told her to apologize. Holly said she was just being honest and someone needed to tell me. She spent the entire reception telling people she would never be caught dead in something so dated, that her dress was going to cost more than our entire wedding. She kept pulling up designer websites on her phone and showing my cousins what real wedding dresses looked like. My aunt overheard her telling someone I probably got my dress from a thrift store, and that Brett must really love me to not care how I looked. The photographer later told me Holly asked him to crop her out of any photos with me because she didn't want to be associated with that dress on social media. For the next 8 months, Holly planned her wedding and made sure I knew about every single detail that would be better than mine. She hired a wedding planner who used to work for celebrities. Her venue was some exclusive country club. She bragged that her flowers alone cost $12,000. Every family dinner turned into Holly showing us her wedding Pinterest boards and saying things like at least someone in the family would have a proper wedding. She actually created a family group chat called Holly's Dream Wedding and posted daily updates. She'd send photos of designer gowns and say things like, "This is what a bride should look like." She made everyone come to 3 different dress shopping appointments. At the last one, she pointed at a puffy sleeve dress and said it reminded her of my disaster. The whole store heard her. The consultant looked uncomfortable. Brett told her to stop, but she said she was trying to help me learn about fashion for future events. 2 months before her wedding, Holly had a crisis. Her dress came in wrong. Something about the beading being silver instead of pearl. She had a complete meltdown, and the designer said they couldn't fix it in time. She tried ordering 3 other dresses, but nothing would arrive before the wedding. She called every high-end bridal shop within 200 miles. Everything needed at least 12 weeks to order. That's when I had my idea. I called Holly and said I felt bad about her dress situation. I told her my mom had other vintage dresses in storage from her sister's weddings in the 80s. They were all different styles, but same era as mine. Holly said she'd rather die than wear anything from that decade. I said I understood, but mentioned one dress was actually pretty classic. Simple ivory silk with minimal lace. She was desperate enough to come look. When she arrived, I showed her 5 dresses. 4 were absolutely hideous on purpose. Bright yellow, lime green ruffles, one with a giant bow on the butt. The 5th was actually nice, but I'd had it taken in by 3 sizes the day before. It would never fit her. Holly tried them all and nothing worked. She was crying about how her wedding was ruined. That's when I pulled out my mom's wedding dress, the one I wore. I said she was right that it wasn't my style anyway, and maybe it would look better on someone with her figure. Holly stared at it for a long minute. Then she tried it on. Here's the thing about vintage dresses. They were made for different body types. Holly was taller than me, and the dress was actually too short on her. The sleeves were too tight. The waist hit her wrong. But she was out of options, and the wedding was in 10 days. She said she could make it work with alterations. The seamstress said alterations would take 3 weeks minimum because of all the lace. Holly had to wear it as is. Holly's wedding day arrived 10 days after she tried on my mom's dress in our living room. Brett and I sat in the 3rd row at the country club she'd bragged about for months, and I watched her walk down the aisle in that vintage gown with the puffy sleeves and lace. The hem hit about 2 inches above her ankles instead of touching the floor like it should have. The sleeves pulled tight across her upper arms every time she moved. The waist sat too high on her torso, making the whole thing look wrong in a way I knew everyone could see but wouldn't say out loud. Keith stood at the altar smiling, but even from where I sat, I could see him glance down at the dress length with a confused expression, before fixing his face back to happy groom mode. My mom sat 2 rows behind us, and I heard her whisper something to my dad about alterations. Brett reached over and squeezed my hand, but didn't say anything during the ceremony. The reception started an hour later in the ballroom Holly had shown us pictures of at least 50 times during family dinners. I sat at our assigned table near the dance floor and watched Holly move through the room greeting guests. She kept tugging at the sleeves every few minutes, pulling them down and adjusting how they sat on her shoulders. The dress rode up when she walked, and she had to smooth it down constantly. She smiled for every photo the photographer took, but I could see the strain around her eyes, the way her jaw stayed tight even when she laughed. 2 women at the table next to ours leaned close together, and one pointed at Holly's dress while they whispered. A man in a gray suit stared at the hem for a solid 5 seconds before his wife elbowed him, and he looked away. Keith's brother made a comment I couldn't quite hear, but 3 people at his table turned to look at Holly, and then quickly looked away. Brett leaned close to me during dinner, and his breath was warm against my ear when he said, "Maybe I should have let her find something else to wear." His voice was quiet and careful, like he knew he was walking into dangerous territory. I turned to face him and reminded him about the 8 months of humiliation Holly put me through. I listed things in a whisper. The community theater comment during my vows, the thrift store accusation to my aunt, the Pinterest boards comparing her proper wedding to my disaster, the dress shopping trip where she pointed at puffy sleeves and made sure the whole store knew she was talking about me. Brett's face changed while I talked, and he went silent because he knew every single word was true, and he'd watched it all happen without stopping her until it was way too late. A woman in a bright blue dress approached Holly near the bar, someone I recognized from the engagement party as one of Holly's college friends. She asked loud enough that I heard her from 3 tables away where Holly found such a unique vintage dress. Her tone was curious but not mean, like she genuinely wanted to know. Holly's face went red in about 2 seconds flat. She mumbled something about it being a family heirloom and changed the subject to the flowers so fast the friend looked confused. Holly touched her friend's arm and steered her toward the windows where the centerpieces were displayed, putting distance between herself and anyone else who might have heard the question. I saw her glance back toward our table once, and our eyes met for maybe half a second before she looked away. The photographer gathered everyone for formal family photos after dinner. He positioned us in groups starting with Holly and Keith, then adding parents, then siblings. I stood next to Holly in 4 different shots, and she kept her body angled slightly away from me in every single one. She looked at the camera but never turned her head even an inch in my direction. The photographer asked us to move closer together for one shot, and I felt Holly's whole body go stiff when our shoulders touched. The tension showed in every frame. Her smile looked painted on, and my own face felt frozen in a polite expression that probably looked just as fake. Brett stood on my other side, and I felt him shift his weight back and forth like he wanted to be anywhere else. Keith's parents joined us for one large family photo, and the photographer had to take it 3 times because someone blinked or moved each time, which just made the awkwardness stretch out longer. Keith's parents sat down at our table during the main course, and his mother asked Holly about the dress while cutting her chicken. She tried to sound nice about it, using words like interesting and classic, but her face showed she didn't understand the style choice at all. Holly explained it was a last-minute situation, that her original dress had issues with the designer, and this was a family piece she could access quickly. Her voice stayed steady, but I watched her hands shake slightly when she picked up her water glass. Keith's father nodded along like he was trying to be supportive, but kept glancing at the too short hem. Holly's face got tighter and tighter as the conversation went on, and she barely touched her food after that. I sat there eating my salmon and acting like I wasn't listening to every word, while Brett kicked my foot under the table in what I think was supposed to be a warning to stay quiet. An older woman who turned out to be Keith's aunt from his dad's side stopped by Holly's table during dessert. I heard her clearly from where I sat because she had one of those voices that carried across rooms without meaning to. She commented that the dress looked like it was from a different era, and asked if that was intentional for some kind of theme wedding. Holly's face flushed red again, darker this time, and she made up something about honoring family traditions. The aunt nodded but looked skeptical and said something about how wedding fashion had changed so much since her own wedding in the 80s. Holly excused herself and headed toward the bathroom, walking fast enough that the too short hem was really obvious with each step. She stayed gone for at least 10 minutes, and when she came back, her eyes looked slightly red, like maybe she'd been crying, or at least trying not to cry. I got up to use the bathroom myself about 20 minutes later and passed 2 of Holly's bridesmaids standing in the hallway near the coat check. They were talking in low voices, but the hallway had weird acoustics that made their conversation carry. One of them said the dress didn't fit right and wondered what happened. The other one explained that Holly told her there was a family emergency with the original dress, and this was the only option available on short notice. Her voice sounded genuinely sympathetic, like she felt bad for Holly having to deal with a wardrobe crisis right before her wedding. The first bridesmaid agreed it was terrible luck and said Holly was handling it well considering the circumstances. They both sighed in that way women do when they're feeling sorry for someone, and then headed back toward the reception. I stood there in the hallway for a minute feeling strange about the whole thing. The first dance happened after cake cutting, and I watched from my seat as Holly and Keith moved across the floor to some romantic song I didn't recognize. The photographer circled them, taking shots from different angles with his big professional camera and bright flash. Every flash lit up the dress and made the fit issues even more obvious than they'd been in regular lighting. The too short hem showed her ankles and the bottom few inches of her calves. The sleeves strained across her upper arms with every movement and pulled at the shoulder seams. The high waist made her torso look weirdly proportioned. I felt satisfaction watching her discomfort play out in real time with everyone watching, but underneath that I felt something else starting to grow. Unease, maybe, or the beginning of guilt, though I pushed it down and told myself she'd earned every second of this after what she put me through. Brett's mother appeared next to my chair during cocktail hour, when I thought everyone was distracted by the open bar. She leaned down and asked quietly if I knew the dress wouldn't fit Holly properly when I offered it. Her tone wasn't mean or accusatory exactly, but there was something in her eyes that made it clear she'd figured out at least part of what happened. I felt defensive immediately and my whole body tensed up. I told her I offered what I had available, and Holly made her own choice to wear it. Brett's mother studied my face for a long moment without saying anything else, then nodded once and walked away toward the bar. I sat there feeling like I'd been caught doing something wrong, even though Holly was the one who started all of this by humiliating me at my own wedding reception in front of everyone we knew. I told her honestly that Holly was desperate, and I offered what I had available. Brett's mother nodded slowly and said she hoped this wouldn't create permanent problems in the family. She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my drink feeling like I'd been dismissed. I watched her join a group of Keith's relatives near the dessert table and wondered what version of events she believed. The rest of cocktail hour dragged on with me avoiding eye contact with most of Brett's family while trying to look casual about it. My own mother found me near the bar about 20 minutes later and pulled me aside to a quiet corner by the coat check. She asked if I was feeling okay about all this, her voice low and concerned. She said she understood why I did it, but worried about the long-term consequences for family gatherings and relationships. I told her I was fine, but my voice came out defensive and sharp. She touched my arm and said she just wanted to make sure I knew what I was getting into with this kind of revenge. I reminded her about every cruel comment Holly made at my wedding, and she sighed and said she remembered all of it. She just hoped I could live with my choice when the satisfaction wore off. That conversation sat heavy in my stomach for the rest of the evening. The wedding continued, and Holly made it through the ceremony and dinner without falling apart completely. I watched her from across the room as she smiled for photos and talked to guests. She kept adjusting the dress every few minutes, tugging at the sleeves and trying to pull the hem down, even though there was nowhere for it to go. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed her disappear toward the bridal suite with two of her bridesmaids following behind. She was gone for almost 30 minutes, and when she came back out, she wore a short white cocktail dress that actually fit her body. The relief on her face when she emerged in something that moved right and hit at the correct places was obvious to everyone watching. Several guests commented on how nice the second dress looked, and Holly's smile finally reached her eyes for the first time all night. Keith's best man stood up to make a toast during the after-party portion, when most people had moved from dinner tables to the lounge area. He talked about Keith and Holly's relationship and how they were perfect for each other. Then he made a joke about vintage fashion making a comeback and how Holly was ahead of the trend. A few people laughed, but the joke fell flat with most of the room. Holly laughed along, but her smile looked painted on and didn't reach her eyes at all. Keith put his arm around her protectively and pulled her close while staring directly at me from across the room. His glare made his feelings crystal clear, and I looked away first, suddenly very interested in my phone. As the reception wound down around 11, Holly's wedding planner approached me near the gift table. She introduced herself as Honoria and said she'd heard so much about me from Holly during the planning process. Her tone was professional, but I could tell she was fishing for information. She mentioned that Holly had described a completely different dress during their planning meetings, something about custom beading and a designer label. She asked what happened with the original gown in a way that sounded casual, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. I gave her a vague explanation about unexpected alterations and timing issues that made the original dress impossible. She looked skeptical and tilted her head like she was trying to figure out if I was lying. She didn't push further, but I caught her giving Holly sympathetic looks and whispering to other vendors for the rest of the evening. The next morning at the family brunch, several relatives pulled me aside privately to ask what happened with Holly's dress. The questions started during breakfast when Brett's cousin cornered me by the coffee station. She said everyone was talking about it and wanted to know the real story. I kept my explanation simple and said there was a problem with Holly's original dress, and mine was available as backup. She nodded, but her expression said she knew there was more to it. 3 more relatives asked similar questions throughout brunch, each one clearly trying to piece together how much I was involved. Word had spread quickly that something went wrong, and people were connecting dots between Holly's comments at my wedding and her dress disaster at hers. My aunt found me in the kitchen helping clean up plates around noon. She squeezed my shoulder and gave me a knowing smile without saying anything out loud. This was the same aunt who heard Holly's thrift store comment at my wedding reception. Her approval was clear in her eyes and the way she patted my arm twice before walking away. That small gesture made me feel slightly better about the whole situation, even though guilt was starting to creep in around the edges. Holly and Keith left for their honeymoon in Bali that afternoon without saying goodbye to Brett and me. We found out they'd gone when Brett's mother mentioned it during brunch cleanup. Keith's coldness toward our family was obvious now in a way it hadn't been before the wedding. Brett admitted to me on the drive home that he was worried about how this would affect his relationship with his sister long-term. He said Holly was the only sibling he had, and he didn't want years of family gatherings to be awkward and tense because of one dress situation. Over the next week, wedding photos started appearing on social media and in the family group chat. Holly posted carefully selected shots that minimized how poorly the dress fit her. Most were close-up face photos or artistic angles that hid the length issues and tight sleeves. There were lots of pictures from after she changed into the cocktail dress. The few full-body shots in the ceremony dress were taken from specific angles that made the fit problems less obvious. She captioned them with things about vintage elegance and timeless style. Several people commented about how beautiful she looked, and nobody mentioned that the dress clearly didn't fit right in person. My cousin Fiona messaged me 3 days after the wedding photos started appearing online. She sent a bunch of screenshots showing Holly's carefully cropped pictures alongside the full ceremony shots where the dress fit problems were super obvious. Fiona remembered everything Holly said at my reception about the thrift store and the community theater costume closet. She wrote that Holly got exactly what she deserved after 8 months of putting me down in front of everyone. But then she added that some relatives were talking about how I wasn't being the bigger person. She said Brett's aunt thought I should have helped Holly find something that actually fit, instead of setting her up to look bad. Fiona warned me that family opinion was split pretty evenly between people who thought I was justified and people who thought I went too far with the revenge. Brett came home from work that evening, and I could tell something was bothering him by how he dropped his bag and went straight to the kitchen without saying hello. I followed him and asked what was wrong. He poured himself water and stared at the sink for a minute before turning around. He admitted that his cousin called him during lunch and said some relatives thought I was cruel for what I did to Holly. I felt my chest get tight and asked which relatives specifically. Brett listed 3 people, including his favorite uncle, who apparently said the dress situation was mean-spirited. I reminded Brett about Holly laughing during our actual vows. I brought up the community theater comment she made right after our ceremony, while everyone was congratulating us. I mentioned the 8 months of her showing everyone designer dress websites and saying mine looked like a thrift store find. I talked about her telling the photographer to crop her out of photos with me because she didn't want to be associated with my dress on social media. Brett sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. He said I had legitimate problems with how Holly treated me, and he understood why I was angry. He acknowledged that watching his sister humiliate me for months was really hard on him too. But he also said he felt stuck between his wife and his only sibling and didn't know how to fix any of it. 2 weeks passed after Holly's wedding, and the family group chat stayed completely silent. Usually, Holly posted hundreds of honeymoon photos with detailed captions about every restaurant and beach and hotel room. The dream wedding chat that had been active every single day for 8 months suddenly had 0 activity. Brett checked his phone constantly, waiting for updates that never came. His mom texted him privately asking if he'd heard from Holly and Keith in Bali. Brett said no, and his mom replied that she was worried about the silence. I felt weird about it too, even though part of me was relieved not to see Holly's face on my phone every morning. The quiet felt heavy and wrong, like everyone was holding their breath waiting for something to explode. Brett's mother called on a Wednesday afternoon and told Brett she was hosting a welcome home dinner for Holly and Keith that Saturday. She said the family needed to come together and move past the wedding drama. Brett hung up and looked at me with this expression of total dread. I spent the entire week feeling sick about having to face Holly. I couldn't sleep well and kept playing out different scenarios in my head of what she might say or do. Brett promised he would support me and stay by my side the whole time. But he also admitted he was dreading the awkwardness and didn't know what to expect from his sister. He said Holly could either pretend nothing happened or completely blow up at me in front of everyone. Neither option sounded good. Saturday arrived and we drove to Brett's mom's house in complete silence. I changed my outfit 3 times before leaving because nothing felt right. My hands were shaking when we pulled into the driveway and I saw Keith's car already parked there. Brett squeezed my hand before we got out. Inside the house, Holly and Keith were in the living room with Brett's parents. Holly looked up when we walked in and her eyes met mine for exactly 1 second before she turned away and started talking to her dad about their flight home. I went to the kitchen to help Brett's mom with appetizers, even though she didn't really need help. For the next hour, Holly and I moved around the house like we were playing some weird game of avoidance. If she went to the living room, I stayed in the kitchen. When she came to get a drink, I went to the bathroom. We never ended up in the same room for more than 30 seconds. The rest of the family noticed and conversations felt forced and uncomfortable. Brett's dad tried to tell a funny story about his golf game, and nobody really laughed. His mom kept asking people if they wanted more food in this too bright voice. Everything felt wrong and tense in a way our family gatherings never had before. Dinner was worse because we couldn't avoid sitting at the same table. Brett's mom had clearly thought about the seating and put Holly and me on opposite ends with the maximum distance possible. Keith sat next to Holly and kept his arm around her chair the whole time. He started making comments about how important family loyalty was, and how treating people with basic respect should be a given. His voice was loud enough that everyone heard him, even though he was technically talking to the person next to him. Everyone knew he was really talking about me. He said something about how some people think being clever is more important than being kind. Brett's fork stopped halfway to his mouth and he put it down. He looked directly at Keith and told him to drop it. The whole table went completely silent. Keith's face turned red and he opened his mouth like he was going to argue, but Holly put her hand on his arm. Nobody said anything for at least a full minute, and the only sound was silverware scraping plates. After dinner, Brett's mother asked Holly and me to help clean up in the kitchen. She basically herded us in there like we were kids who needed a timeout together. Holly went to the far side of the kitchen island and started rinsing plates. I stood on the opposite side loading the dishwasher. Brett's mom handed us dishes and watched us with this frustrated expression, like she was waiting for one of us to speak first. The silence stretched out and became painful. I could hear everyone else in the living room talking in low voices. Water ran in the sink. Plates clinked. Holly scrubbed the same dish for way too long. Brett's mom sighed loudly and asked if we were planning to ignore each other forever. Neither of us answered her. Holly finally stopped washing and turned off the water. Her voice came out flat and cold without any of her usual dramatic flair. She said she knew what I did and she knew why I did it. She wasn't yelling or crying. She just sounded tired and hurt. I realized she wasn't angry about being embarrassed in front of people. She was genuinely hurt that I set her up that way. Her hands were still in the sink and she wasn't looking at me. She said she spent the whole honeymoon thinking about how her own family deliberately made her wedding day worse. I felt something twist in my stomach that might have been guilt, but I pushed it down. I told Holly that she spent 8 months making me feel worthless about my wedding dress. I said I offered her real help when she needed it by showing her all those dresses at my mom's house. Holly turned around then, and her face was different from I'd ever seen it. She argued that I deliberately showed her horrible options first and saved my dress for last when she was desperate. She said I knew exactly what I was doing by having that one nice dress taken in so it wouldn't fit. I didn't deny any of it because we both knew she was right. I did set her up. I did plan the whole thing. I just stood there holding a wet plate and looking at her. Holly said she would have apologized at some point for the things she said at my wedding. She said that now she felt like we were even, and she didn't owe me anything anymore. Her voice got stronger when she said it, like she was convincing herself. I asked her when exactly she planned to apologize. I pointed out that eventually only came after her dress emergency when she needed something from me. I said she had 8 months to apologize, and she spent that time making sure I knew my wedding was garbage compared to hers. Holly opened her mouth and then closed it again. She couldn't really argue with that. Brett's mom looked between us and left the kitchen without saying anything. We stood there in silence for another minute before going back to washing dishes like nothing happened. We loaded the last of the dishes into the dishwasher and dried our hands on the same towel without speaking. Brett's mom had left us alone to work things out, and we'd reached some kind of understanding without actually saying much. Holly went back to the dining room first, and I followed a minute later. Brett looked up when we walked in separately but close together, and I could see the question in his eyes. His mom watched us take our seats at opposite ends of the table, and her shoulders relaxed just a little. The rest of dinner passed with everyone making careful conversation about safe topics like work and weather. Nobody mentioned weddings or dresses or anything that might set either of us off. Keith kept his arm around Holly's chair and shot me looks when he thought I wasn't paying attention. When we finally left that night, Brett asked me in the car if Holly and I were okay now. I told him we weren't okay, but we weren't going to make things worse. He seemed to accept that as the best he could hope for. The next month brought 3 more family gatherings, and Holly and I perfected the art of polite distance. At Brett's dad's birthday dinner, we stood on opposite sides of the living room during cocktails. When someone asked Holly about married life, I moved to the kitchen. When Brett's mom showed me photos on her phone, Holly excused herself to the bathroom. We spoke when we had to, asking each other to pass dishes or agreeing on what time to arrive at the next event. Our conversations never went deeper than surface pleasantries about the food or the weather. Everyone noticed, but nobody said anything. Brett's cousins stopped trying to include both of us in the same conversations. His aunts divided their attention between us like they were managing a custody arrangement. At his mom's book club gathering, someone actually made a seating chart to keep us separated. The whole family tiptoed around us like we were unexploded bombs that might go off if we got too close. Keith made his feelings clear at every gathering. At the book club thing, he sat on the far side of the room even though it meant squishing onto a love seat with 2 other people, instead of taking the empty chair next to Brett. When I joined a conversation about vacation plans, Keith suddenly remembered he needed to help Holly in the kitchen. At a Sunday brunch, he and Holly arrived late, and Keith steered her to seats at the opposite end of the table from where Brett and I were sitting. He never said anything directly rude, but his body language screamed disapproval. He'd turn his back when I entered a room. He'd check his phone whenever I spoke. At one dinner, I overheard him tell Holly they should skip the next family event because he didn't want to deal with the tension. She convinced him to come anyway, but he spent the whole evening looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Brett tried talking to him once, pulling him aside after dinner, but Keith just shrugged and said, family loyalty mattered. Brett came back looking frustrated and didn't want to talk about it. 3 weeks after that conversation, Brett came to bed late one night and just lay there staring at the ceiling. I asked him what was wrong, and he was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he told me Holly had called him earlier. She'd been looking through her wedding photos while making an album, and she'd started crying. She told Brett she felt humiliated every time she saw herself in those pictures. The dress looked wrong in every shot, and she couldn't stop seeing how badly it fit. Brett wasn't asking me to apologize. He made that clear. He was just telling me what his sister had said. But I could hear the weight in his voice. He loved both of us, and watching us hurt each other was killing him. He rolled over and put his arm around me, and we lay there in the dark, not talking about it anymore. I knew he wished things were different. I did too, kind of. But I also remembered 8 months of Holly's comments and the look on her face when she'd called my dress a disaster. I waited 2 days before asking Brett if he thought I was wrong. We were making dinner together, and I just said it out loud while chopping vegetables. He stopped stirring the pasta and stood there with the spoon in his hand. The silence stretched out long enough that I started to regret asking. Finally, he said he understood why I did it. He'd watched Holly tear me down for months, and it had made him angry too. But he wished I'd found a different way to handle it. He said watching me get humiliated for 8 months was awful, and he'd wanted to do something about it himself. Now watching his family fall apart was also painful. His sister was miserable about her wedding photos. His parents were stressed about family gatherings. Keith barely spoke to us anymore. Brett said he didn't know if there was a right answer, but he knew the current situation hurt everyone. He went back to stirring the pasta, and I went back to chopping vegetables. We ate dinner mostly in silence, both of us thinking about things we couldn't fix. My mom called the next afternoon while I was at work. I stepped outside to take the call, and she asked how I was doing in that tone that meant she already knew something. She'd talked to Brett's mother the day before. Apparently some family members thought I'd gone too far with the dress situation. Not everyone, my mom clarified, but enough that Brett's mom had mentioned it. My mom said she supported me and always would. Holly had been cruel, and I'd had every right to be angry. But then she reminded me that revenge often costs more than we expect when we're planning it. She said she'd watched me plot the whole dress thing, and she'd known it would feel good in the moment. She also knew it would create problems that lasted longer than the satisfaction. I asked her if she thought I was wrong, and she said wrong and right weren't always the useful questions. Sometimes we do things that are justified, but still have consequences we don't want to live with. She told me to think about what kind of relationship I wanted with Brett's family 5 years from now. Then she had to go because she was meeting a friend for lunch. I stood outside my office building for 10 more minutes before going back to work. 3 months after Holly's wedding, Keith's parents hosted Thanksgiving at their house in the suburbs. The invitation came through the family group chat, and I knew it would be awkward before we even arrived. When we got there, Keith's mom had made a seating chart. She'd actually printed out little place cards with everyone's names. Holly was at one end of the long dining table. I was at the other end. Brett sat in the middle like a buffer zone between warring countries. Keith was next to Holly, and Brett's parents were spread out to fill the space. The deliberate arrangement made everyone uncomfortable. Brett's aunt mentioned how nice it was that the table was so long, then trailed off when she realized what she was really saying. One of Keith's cousins asked why we weren't sitting by couples, and Keith's mom changed the subject quickly. We all took our assigned seats and passed dishes across the vast distance between us. Conversation felt forced. People kept looking between Holly and me like they were watching a tennis match. Someone's uncle said it was sad when family couldn't sit together, and an awkward silence fell over the whole table until Brett's dad started talking loudly about football. The meal dragged on with everyone trying too hard to act normal. Holly's friend from college was there, sitting near Holly's end of the table. She started talking about some magazine articles she'd read recently. She said there was a whole spread about vintage fashion coming back, and some celebrity had worn a dress with puffy sleeves and tons of lace to an awards show. The article called it fashion-forward and romantic. Holly's face went tight immediately. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and she set it down carefully on her plate. Her friend kept talking, saying the celebrity's dress reminded her of something, but she couldn't remember what. Holly interrupted and asked someone to pass the cranberry sauce, even though it was right next to her. She changed the subject to Keith's new promotion at work, speaking quickly and not making eye contact with anyone. Her friend looked confused, but let it drop. I watched Holly's hand shake slightly when she picked up her water glass. Keith put his hand over hers and glared down the table at me like I'd somehow planned this moment. The rest of dinner continued with everyone pretending that exchange hadn't happened. After we finished eating, people scattered to different rooms. Some went to the living room to watch football. Others helped clean up in the kitchen. I grabbed my coat and went out to the back porch for some air. The cold November wind felt good after the stuffiness inside. I stood at the railing looking at Keith's parents' backyard, which was mostly dead grass and bare trees. I heard the door open behind me and assumed it was Brett coming to check on me. But when I turned around, it was Holly. She had her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and she didn't say anything at first. We just stood there on opposite sides of the porch. The silence stretched out for a couple minutes. Finally, Holly said something that surprised me. She said she'd been insecure about her wedding compared to mine. Everyone in the family kept talking about how beautiful and meaningful my dress was, how special it was that I wore my mom's dress, how the vintage style was so unique and personal. Holly said she'd felt like she couldn't compete with that kind of sentimental value. Holly kept talking, her voice quiet and flat. She said she'd started planning this huge, expensive wedding to prove hers could be better in different ways. But every time someone mentioned my dress or my wedding, she felt worse. She couldn't compete with family history and emotional significance. So instead of dealing with her own feelings, she'd tried to tear my dress down. She'd convinced herself that if she could make everyone think my dress was ugly and outdated, then her expensive designer dress would automatically be better. She'd spent 8 months trying to rewrite everyone's memory of my wedding. Holly stopped talking and looked out at the dead yard. She didn't apologize directly. She didn't say the words, "I'm sorry." But this explanation was the closest thing to an apology I was going to get. I stood there processing what she'd said. All that cruelty and those months of comments had come from jealousy, rather than genuine malice. Holly hadn't hated my dress because it was actually ugly. She'd hated it because everyone loved it and she didn't know how to handle that. I realized we'd both been terrible to each other, but at least now I understood why she'd started it. Understanding didn't fix anything, but it made the whole situation feel slightly less pointless. I took a breath and looked at Holly standing there in the cold. I told her I understood feeling insecure about things, but that didn't excuse 8 months of public humiliation and deliberate cruelty. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself and nodded slowly. She said she knew that, and that she probably deserved what happened, even though it still hurt to experience it. Her voice was quiet, and she wasn't making excuses anymore, just stating facts. We stood there for another minute in silence before she started talking again. She said the whole thing with my dress had gotten out of control because she couldn't stop herself once she started. Every time someone complimented my wedding, she felt worse about her own plans. She'd convinced herself that tearing me down would somehow build herself up. I asked her if it worked, and she laughed without any humor. She said obviously not, since she ended up wearing the same dress she'd spent months mocking. We talked for another 20 minutes about the whole situation, both of us acknowledging our parts and how things escalated. Holly admitted she wished she'd just been honest about feeling jealous instead of being mean. I told her I could have confronted her directly instead of engineering revenge. She said that was fair, but also pointed out that I'd tried talking to her through Brett and his mom, and she'd ignored both attempts. I couldn't really argue with that. Holly asked me if I felt better now that she'd experienced public embarrassment about a dress. I thought about it for a minute before answering honestly. I told her it felt satisfying initially, but now mostly just felt sad. She nodded and said that was fair. She said she was learning that humiliating people has consequences that come back around. We both agreed we'd hurt each other and that continuing to hurt each other wasn't helping anyone. Holly said we probably wouldn't ever be close friends, and I agreed with her. But we both said we could work toward being actual family, who treat each other with basic respect. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation with hugs and tears. Just two people acknowledging reality and agreeing to try harder going forward. Holly said she should get back inside before Keith came looking for her. I said I'd stay out for a few more minutes. She nodded and went back through the door, leaving me alone on the porch again. I stayed outside for another 5 minutes before going back in. The house was warm and loud with conversation and football commentary from the TV. Brett was in the kitchen helping his mom put away leftovers. When I walked in, he looked up immediately, and his eyes went straight to my face. I could tell he was trying to figure out what happened with Holly. I gave him a small smile and he relaxed a little. Holly was in the living room with Keith, sitting close together on the couch. When I passed by to get some water, she looked up and we made eye contact for a second. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. We were genuinely civil for the first time since her wedding. Brett noticed immediately that something had shifted between us. He squeezed my hand later when we were alone in the hallway and whispered, asking if everything was okay. I told him Holly and I had talked and reached an understanding. Relief flooded his face and he pulled me into a quick hug. Over the next few weeks, family gatherings remained slightly awkward but not hostile. Holly and I spoke when necessary and kept things polite. Keith was a different story. He remained cold toward me even after Holly and I reached our understanding. He'd leave rooms when I entered them and kept conversations short when we had to interact. Holly pulled me aside at Brett's parents' house one evening and told me privately that Keith was having trouble letting go of how upset she'd been after the wedding. She said she was working on it, but that he was protective and held grudges longer than she did. I told her I understood and that I wasn't going to push anything. She seemed grateful for that. Christmas arrived faster than I expected. For the first time in months, Holly and I exchanged gifts at the family gathering at Brett's parents' house. I got her a nice candle set from that expensive store she liked. She got me a bottle of wine. They were impersonal gifts that could have been for anyone, but the gesture mattered more than the items themselves. Brett's mom looked pleased when she saw us exchange them. During Christmas dinner, Holly mentioned a work promotion she was excited about, something about becoming a senior account manager. I congratulated her genuinely without any underlying tension or fake enthusiasm. She thanked me and actually seemed to mean it. Brett squeezed my hand under the table and I knew he was grateful for the progress we'd made. Keith's parents commented on how nice it was to see Holly and me getting along better. Both of us felt uncomfortable because it highlighted how obvious our conflict had been to everyone. But we smiled and nodded and let them believe things were fully healed, even though we both knew the relationship was still fragile. We weren't friends and probably never would be, but we could sit at the same table without tension radiating off us. New Year's Eve brought another family gathering, this time at Keith's parents' house. They had a big place with a finished basement where everyone gathered to watch the countdown. Holly found me in the kitchen around 10 o'clock while I was refilling my drink. She asked me about my job and actually listened to my answer. I told her about a difficult client I'd been dealing with, and she asked follow-up questions that showed she was paying attention. We had a real conversation for the first time since before my wedding, discussing work and life without any barbs or hidden meanings. It felt strange, but also good. When midnight came, everyone counted down together and cheered. Holly and I were standing near each other and we did that awkward half-hug thing that people do when they're not quite friends but not enemies either. Keith still looked uncomfortable with me, but he was polite enough to say Happy New Year. Brett looked happier than I'd seen him in months, watching his sister and wife actually getting along. Brett came home around 11 that night and found me on the couch scrolling through my phone. He sat down next to me and rubbed his eyes. He looked tired but also lighter somehow. He told me he'd talked to Holly on the drive home from Keith's parents' house. She'd mentioned that she actually respected what I'd done even though the method was harsh. Brett said she told him she probably would have kept being cruel if I hadn't shown her there were consequences. That perspective hadn't occurred to me before. I'd been so focused on whether my revenge was justified that I hadn't thought about what might have happened if I'd done nothing. Holly might have spent years making snide comments at every family gathering. The dress situation forced a reckoning that words never would have. January brought cold weather and a phone call I never expected. Holly's name appeared on my screen one Tuesday afternoon while I was making dinner. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering. She asked if I had a minute to talk about something. Her voice sounded uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. She explained that Keith's parents were pressuring them about moving closer to their side of the family. They wanted Holly and Keith to buy a house in their neighborhood. Keith was considering it, but Holly felt torn because it would mean leaving Brett and her mom. She asked what I thought she should do. The question hung in the air between us. This was the first time Holly had ever called me directly for advice. It was a small thing, just one phone call about a family problem, but it felt like genuine progress. I took a breath and told her what I honestly thought. I said she should talk to Keith about compromises like living somewhere in the middle. I suggested she be direct with his parents about wanting to stay near her own family. I told her that moving somewhere out of obligation usually led to resentment. Holly listened without interrupting. When I finished, she thanked me and said she appreciated the honest perspective. She told me she'd think about what I said. We hung up after a few more minutes of awkward small talk. Brett walked into the kitchen right after and asked who'd called. When I told him it was Holly asking for advice, his jaw actually dropped. He said his sister never asked anyone for help with anything. She'd always been too proud to admit she needed input or support. That's when I realized how much our confrontation at the wedding had actually affected her. Something had shifted in how she saw me and our relationship. Valentine's Day arrived with an unexpected text in the family group chat. Holly posted an invitation for a double-date dinner at some Italian place downtown. She tagged Brett and me specifically. I read the message twice to make sure I understood it correctly. Brett saw it at work and called me immediately. He sounded excited and nervous at the same time. He said this was a big deal because Holly was making a real effort to include us as a couple. I agreed to go, even though the idea made my stomach tight. We met them at the restaurant on a Friday night. The place had white tablecloths and candles on every table. Holly and Keith were already seated when we arrived. Keith stood up and shook Brett's hand, but barely looked at me. Holly hugged her brother and then gave me a small wave. We sat down, and the first 10 minutes felt stiff and awkward. Keith studied the menu like it contained secret codes. Holly kept the conversation moving by asking Brett about his new project at work. She asked me about my job and actually waited for my full answer. We talked about normal things like vacation plans and movies we'd seen recently. Keith slowly warmed up as dinner went on. He told a story about a disaster at his office that was actually funny. By dessert, the tension had eased enough that we could all laugh at the same joke. It felt almost natural by the time we paid the check. Holly caught my arm as we were leaving the restaurant. She asked if we could talk outside for a minute while Brett and Keith got the cars. We stood under the awning in the cold February air. Holly looked at me directly and said she wanted to move forward instead of staying stuck in the past. She acknowledged that we'd both made mistakes. She said continuing to punish each other wasn't helping anyone, especially not Brett, who loved both of us. Her words came out carefully, like she'd practiced them. I told her I agreed that moving forward made sense. We shook hands in this slightly formal but genuine way. It wasn't a warm hug or a tearful moment, just two people deciding to be adults about a messy situation. Brett pulled up in our car and I got in. He asked what Holly and I talked about. I told him we'd agreed to try harder. He smiled wider than I'd seen in months. The next few months passed with surprising normalcy. Holly and I developed a functional relationship built on mutual respect rather than real affection. We attended family dinners and birthday parties without the heavy tension that used to fill every room. We had pleasant conversations about surface-level things like work projects and weekend plans. We were never going to be best friends who called each other to chat or went shopping together. We weren't going to share secrets or ask each other for deep advice, but we could sit at the same table and have a normal conversation. We could stand next to each other in family photos without faking smiles. It was enough. Brett's mother pulled me aside at Easter dinner and said she was relieved the family drama had settled down. She admitted things would probably never be quite the same as before. I agreed with her completely. Some actions and words couldn't be erased no matter how much time passed. They just got incorporated into a new version of normal. The dress situation would always be part of our family history. People would always remember what happened, but at least now we could be in the same room without everyone holding their breath. A year after Holly's wedding, someone posted a throwback photo in the family group chat. It was from my wedding day. I was standing with my mom and Brett in front of the lake. My vintage dress looked exactly how I remembered it, with all the lace and puffy sleeves. The photo had been taken right after the ceremony when everyone was still happy and celebrating. Within seconds, Holly reacted with a heart emoji. Then she typed a comment that made my phone feel hot in my hand. She wrote that my dress really was beautiful. The group chat went completely silent. No one responded for a full minute. I stared at those words on my screen. Holly had spent 8 months tearing down that dress. She'd called it ugly and dated and embarrassing. She'd compared it to theater costumes and thrift store disasters. And now she was publicly saying it was beautiful. Other family members started responding with their own positive comments about the dress and the wedding. My mom sent 3 heart emojis. Brett's mother wrote that it was one of the most meaningful weddings she'd ever attended. My cousins added memories about how special the day had been. I opened the group chat and clicked on Holly's name to send her a private message. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second before I typed that I wanted to thank her for what she wrote about my dress. I added that I knew how hard it probably was for her to say something nice about the dress she'd spent so long tearing apart. The message sat there with 1 checkmark for about 5 minutes before it changed to 2 checkmarks showing she'd read it. Then the 3 dots appeared showing she was typing. Her response came through saying she meant what she wrote and that she was sorry it took her this long to say it. She added that she should have apologized a long time ago for everything she said at my wedding and during all those months after. I stared at those words on my phone screen, knowing this was the real apology I never got before. Not the forced one at Thanksgiving or the awkward truce in the kitchen. This felt genuine because she chose to say it without anyone watching or forcing her hand. I wrote back that I appreciated her saying that and left it there. We didn't need to rehash everything or have some big emotional conversation. The acknowledgement was enough. That night after I got ready for bed, Brett came into the bathroom while I was brushing my teeth. He leaned against the doorframe and said he was proud of both me and Holly for how we'd handled everything. He said most families would have let something like the dress situation create splits that never healed. People would have taken sides and stopped talking to each other and made every holiday awkward for years. But somehow Holly and I had managed to build something that actually worked, even if it wasn't perfect. We weren't best friends and probably never would be, but we could be in the same room without everyone feeling tense. We could have normal conversations and attend family events without drama. He said that took real effort from both of us, and he was grateful we'd both been willing to try. I rinsed my mouth and told him it was still weird sometimes, but that weird was better than hostile. He kissed my forehead and said he'd take weird over hostile any day of the week. Looking back at everything now with some distance from it all, I know what I did with the dress was petty. I could have been the bigger person and just let Holly's comments roll off me. I could have confronted her directly about how much she hurt me instead of setting up an elaborate revenge plan. I could have refused to help her when her dress fell through and let her figure it out on her own. Any of those choices would have been more mature than what I actually did. But I also don't entirely regret how things went down, because it forced both of us to deal with consequences we'd been avoiding. Holly had to experience what it felt like to be publicly embarrassed about something personal and important. She had to wear a dress that didn't fit right and feel uncomfortable in her own wedding photos. She had to face the reality that her words and actions toward me had real effects that came back around. And I had to sit with the knowledge that revenge doesn't actually make you feel better in the long run. The satisfaction wore off pretty quickly, and what remained was just the mess we both had to clean up. But that mess led to honest conversations we never would have had otherwise. It pushed us to actually address the hurt instead of pretending everything was fine. Now Holly and I have a relationship built on mutual understanding that actions have consequences for everyone involved. We both know where the boundaries are and what happens when you cross them. Sometimes the messy, complicated path through a problem leads to a more real destination than taking the high road ever would have. We're not close, but we're honest with each other, and that feels more valuable than fake politeness would have been.